Welcome, everybody, and thank you for listening to the first episode of Nuance, a new podcast from me, journalist Roberto Alejandro, and police scientist Mike Wood, the former Baltimore police sergeant famous for combating racism in policing and, more importantly, defending the city from zombies. We are joined for this first episode by public health expert and activist in the movement for Black Lives, Dr. Lawrence Brown, for a discussion about what the election of Donald J. Trump means for the future of police reform, the movement for Black Lives, and our overall democracy. Thank you, Dr. Brown, for joining us.
Thank you for having me.
Let me start by asking you, Dr. Brown, particularly in light of all the work you've been doing in the movement for Black Lives, what do you think is the significance for the election of Donald Trump for this movement?
Well, I think that we'll see an intensification of repression and repressive sort of policing tactics around the nation because he's a candidate that called for law and order very specifically. And I think that a lot of the voters that supported him in many ways supported him because of a backlash to Black Lives Matter. The sort of racial antagonism of feeling threatened, I believe, by this movement, which has been very militant. We've seen 5 uprisings around the country, starting in Ferguson outside of St. Louis, then Baltimore, then Baton Rouge, Milwaukee, and Charlotte. And I think for a lot of people, they looked at that and felt threatened on some level or another, especially in a movement where people were concerned about their guns being taken away and felt like, you know, the government is probably not taking a harsh enough stand against Black Lives Matter. You saw on Fox News this sort of rhetoric of Black Lives Matter being a terrorist group. So people were, I think, you know, primed there in the conservative movement to support a very repressive crackdown on the movement for Black Lives. And I expect that sort of escalating tension. And if you escalate tension, I think you'll also see escalating solidarity. And so I predict the movement will grow as the repression grows.
Interesting. I mean, certainly I know that during the presidency of George W. Bush, which for progressives might have been something of a precursor to, you know, what I imagine a lot of the sort of policy and social issue fights will be over the next 4 years. You know, during the presidency of George W. Bush, there was a lot of sort of concerted activism against any number of policies. And so it sounds like you feel like that will probably occur again. And do you think it might have the potential to push the needle on issues? I mean, I remember how big an issue gay marriage was in the 2000 election, right? And now that's a constitutional right, the law of the land. And even Trump himself has said he doesn't feel the need to revisit it. Do you see a sort of similar energy likely to arise on the left on Black Lives, but also any number of other progressive issues?
Well, I mean, I hesitate to think that there will be any positive movement as it relates to the movement for Black Lives. And, you know, I think if we're honest, it's not just, you know, due to the election of Donald Trump. Even under the presidency of Barack Obama, I think we have to realize the sort of tepid response, you know, the very sort of lackluster and low-key response to Black Lives Matter protests and demands. And so there's a studied disregard, I think, for Black lives in America.
Do you find that on both
speaking.
the left and right of our politics?
Oh, absolutely. I think on the right, it's a bit more blatant. On the left, it's a bit more nuanced, to highlight the name of the show.
Yeah.
But, you know, you talk about Hillary Clinton, who just ran, you know, she, you know, in the past, you know, used phrase like super predators, bringing them to heel, supporting the 1994 omnibus crime bill, and, you know, the sort of being receiving funds from people who built private prisons and those private prison corporations. So the notion that, you know, either on the left or right, that there has been a sufficient response to the demands of the movement, I think we have to disabuse ourselves of that notion. Like, really, this country is founded on a foundation of white supremacy, and that foundation is very sturdy, and it really hasn't been cracked in any sufficient way.
Mike, let's bring you in, especially because so much of the energy of the movement for Black Lives has focused on the issue of police reforms for obvious reasons over the last few years. But, that said, I think that the name, right, the Movement for Black Lives, speaks to the fact that this is not just about policing. But we all remember the sort of imagery we saw coming out of Ferguson, the first time we sort of saw the fruits of the post 9/11 policy of bringing militarized weapons to police departments, or at least at an increasing level, and seeing those things turned on American citizens. And one could imagine, in light of the rhetoric about ISIS in the Middle East that we've seen from Donald J. Trump, that we could soon see ourselves with an administration and an attorney general that is committed to the sort of post 9/11 Bush year doctrines of American law enforcement that we saw. Where do you see the fight for reform in policing standing under this presidency?
My police scientist work, so to say, has made me feel like there's only three things that really build the plank of policing, and those three things invade the rest of our society, and that is a form of slavery or the new Jim Crow, the protection of white property, and the continued genocide of the Native American people. So that's what we still see right now, and I mean, our current administration hasn't done anything to address these issues or improve them whatsoever, and has actively contributed to making them worse. So those three planks remain for me, and that's my main fight, is against those three planks. So do we see more tension and solidarity, more tension coming from the extremes and maybe a little solidarity extremes? Yeah, maybe. Was it there? Are we having selective cognitive bias when we see those things because now we're looking for them? So it's like we all went out and bought a red car, so now we all see that there's red cars everywhere, and it kind of creates a cycle where you sow your own thoughts. And the way this election went, I mean, I went around the Midwest of this country traveling, speaking. And from my trips to Indiana all the way across to New Jersey, I saw hundreds of Trump signs and one Hillary Clinton sign the entire time. So we have the media telling a story that's just false because we have pundits that act like they know things, and they literally know nothing, and we're still listening to them and what their thoughts are after this. So what is it? Is it Trump or is it us as a country? I think Trump is a reflection of us, not these people are a reflection of Trump. This has already existed, and now they have their excuse. They have their thing to rally around. But I really don't think anything at all changes for me. Maybe I get more allies and comrades into this because now they see it more, and that's what I always struggle with, is getting people to see it more.
Yeah.
So now maybe they see it more. We'll get some more of that solidarity. But in all practical reality, I understand the rhetoric is shit. But I have zero reason to believe that policy will change that will directly affect people at this current time. I mean, if Trump is so inept that he can't achieve anything, why do we think he's apt enough to achieve some complex policy that would, end up hurting black lives in the end? I don't. I mean, I think we have the racism, and we have all these things that were going to come down on our society, but they were there. Hopefully we're just more aware of them.
Can I address that?
Yeah, absolutely.
Because I think actually the danger is that Trump is surrounded by a Republican Congress, the ability to stack the Supreme Court to move in an ultra-conservative direction. And so the potential for regressive, racist, white supremacist policy, I think, is tremendous. But it's not really because of Trump. It's the Congress that if they pass and he signs it, then I think we could very well see some real issues. Now, I do think where Trump will play a role is undoing some of the executive orders that President Barack Obama passed during his presidency. So, like the HUD rule to affirmatively further fair housing, I believe he'll strike that down. He'll undo some of the policies and ways in which the My Brother's Keeper program and the policies to sort of address employment for black and Latino youth, for those young men, for the criminal justice system and its interaction to give second chances. I think he'll undo a lot of those things, the executive through the executive policies that he has control over, executive orders, I should say. So I think there is a danger in that sense, but it's not solely Trump. It's the fact that Republicans have the chance to control all three branches of our federal government, and that'll be the harm.
I mean, it's interesting because earlier when you were speaking, you mentioned the fact that you don't necessarily feel like the left or right of our politics has really adequately addressed the concerns of the movement for Black lives. And Mike, you also just mentioned that you feel like our current administration has done any number of things that contributed to some of these issues that have arisen among the Black Lives Movement, among the fight for police reform. And so, particularly in light of, we're all persons who are old enough to remember George W. Bush years. This is not our first time under a Republican administration, I suspect, that we vehemently disagree with. Do we think that this is actually then a unique moment in American politics? Or is it kind of like you said, Mike, is this a moment where we're just kind of seeing what a lot of the rest of the country looks like, those of us who live in urban spaces like Baltimore, Maryland?
Yeah, I mean, I don't ever want to sound like I support anything Trump does. I think the entire system is corrupt. I think every single one of them are evil, and they all stand in our way of getting justice in our communities, every single last of them. So I kind of see them all clumped together and don't see them as separate things. As this goes on, and we all speculate and talk about it, literally these conversations already took place with Barry Goldwater and a couple of other people in the past. People were saying the same thing about Reagan when he was coming in. And yeah, he was disastrous, but these are disasters we have constantly with every... It's kind of like just what lens you're looking at the disaster through.
Kind of every other administration, right, at least since Reagan.
Trump wants to get rid of TPP, and that's hugely important to people in the Midwest, just like Bernie did.
Yeah.
So, I mean, Trump's policies actually has more crossover with Bernie than we have with Hillary. And then I've been sitting there listening to NPR and being into this all, and I will hear them use a Trump statement and say how bad it is. But I already know that the next day he clarified that and put nuance to it, and that wasn't mentioned in the NPR report. So they already set. It's like the stage has been set, and what is this system? So this system is about the ultra elite people setting up things like race as invented categories, and making us all, tricking all of us into thinking we're each other's enemies as we all fight one another and they get richer. I just don't see that that's changed.
Doc, what do you think about this? Do you feel like we're in an actually unique moment in American politics?
I think there are certain things that are unique. The Southern Poverty Leadership Conference said that there have been like 300 violent incidents since like the election of Donald Trump. Muslims being attacked, gay and transgender folks being attacked, women wearing hijabs, black people in rural areas. So there is something, I think, that there's an overt sort of ascension of this sort of racist appeal, what's been called the alt-right. I mean, you have Steve Bannon being placed into positions of power, these overt white supremacists. These aren't people that like hid it. They've been very clear and open with it. So I think there is something afoot. And I think that on some level we'll look back historically and we'll see, just like after Reconstruction you had white redemption in the South to overdo black Reconstruction. After Civil Rights you had the Southern strategy with Lee Atwater and sort of the mutation of white supremacy. And now after the election of Obama you have this overt appeal to make America great again, even though the economy has been moving in an upward trajectory. We came out of a great recession, but of course, everyone hasn't felt the wealth sort of spread in a very even way, especially in middle America. But under the President Obama, actually, America has been doing very well, and so Trump was effective in making an appeal, a very racialized appeal, to build a wall, to keep Muslims out of the country, to keep Mexican rapists out of the country. He didn't hide what he said. He didn't code it like the former GOP did. He actually made it very explicit. So I think we're dealing with an intensified, more explicit level of white supremacy that we haven't seen in about 50 years. And I think it's here to stay. Trumpism is here to stay.
And I'm afraid that's all the time we have for the first episode of Nuance. I want to thank my co-hosts, Mike Wood, and our guest, Dr. Lawrence Brown, for joining us for this important conversation. Thank you so much, guys.
My pleasure.
Thank you.
And for everybody out there, don't forget to subscribe to Nuance, the new podcast from journalist Roberto Alejandro and Mike Wood, zombie fighter and police reformer.
Thank you for telling that zombie story.